Now, of the powers of the president, this one probably takes a little longer for us to analyze. The role of commander in chief is seen as one of the most important powers of the president, and one that is kind of complex. I mean, we just talked about in the Congress unit the idea that Congress controls, the right to declare war. But who actually controls the troops? According to the Constitution, the troops are controlled by the commander in chief, by the president. That means the president is technically in charge of deploying troops and ordering those forces to do things. Essentially, the boss of the generals. And in fact, George Washington showed this when he actually led troops as president. He led troops against the Whiskey Rebellion, which was going on in western Pennsylvania. He took troops from, I believe, Virginia and some of the East Coast states and took them to western Pennsylvania to put down a rebellion against taxes. So the president can literally lead and order the troops. That is part of his job. But this creates a lot of potential problems because in today's world, it's not as easy as like, okay, you're taking troops and it's going to take a while to actually get to a location. In today's world, we have troops and the ability to basically attack any place on the planet. So this deploying of troops ends up becoming very, very complex. And where do you draw the line? Where do you draw the line between a military operation and warfare? Is there a certain amount of time that has to go by? Because you didn't really have military operations back in the 1700s. It was war or not. Someone declared war in another country. And then it took forever for the war to actually start. They had to get troops in place. They had to send troops around. War didn't happen in a second. But today, the president has the ability to, launch missiles at pretty much any location on the planet. Has the ability to use the nuclear weapons at any time without any checks or restrictions. In fact, there's very little restrictions on just utilizing the troops. What's stopping the president from utilizing drones to kill people in other countries? What's stopping the president from, dropping in forces in another country? And this is where we get into an area where there's not a lot of restrictions, and it creates problems. Can the president essentially drag us into a war? Can they start a military operation and end up basically never leaving and forcing Congress's hand? And we're kind of in that area of time where the president can authorize a military operation and it can go on and on and on. And I think of the Vietnam War, for example. The Vietnam War was not really a war to start with. It was a military operation to try to stop the spread of communism in Vietnam. And then it escalated further and further, and it took more time. And eventually, Congress would have to authorize the draft. Congress would have to authorize tons of money, tons of resources being shipped to the Vietnam War. Where in all essence, it was really a military operation. And a lot of things can happen really, really fast because of the president's ability to control troops and weapons that can respond really, really fast. We have aircraft carriers all over the planet. We have, battleships. We have military bases. We have Air Force bases. We are not even just in our country. So the idea is that basically we can strike anywhere on the planet when needed, but it doesn't necessarily take a declaration of war, which creates a lot of issues. And after Vietnam, Congress basically shoved through and overrid a veto on a law called the War Powers Act. And the War Powers Act is meant to try and restrict the presidency. So it's trying to check the presidency with a law. Now, it's never really been enforced because if the president breaks the War Powers Act, how do you check the president at that point? It would pretty much require impeachment. It would require the Congress to stand up to the president and remove them for their actions. And this is how the War Powers Act works. It does allow for the president to respond quickly and use that military operation idea. And we need that in today's world where the president needs to be able to respond really quickly. And Hamilton talks about that in Federalist 70. We need an executive that can respond very, very quickly. But Congress doesn't want this to be too hasty. So in the War Powers Act, it says that Congress has to be notified in advance before sending in troops. Now, note, this says sending in troops. Back in Vietnam, we were talking about sending in a lot of troops. And today in warfare, we might not even land troops for a while. A lot can be taken care of with surface-to-air missiles. A lot can be taken care of with the Air Force without ever setting foot on land. Okay, I digress there a little bit. So you got to notify Congress, and then you have 60 days for your military operation. And then after those 60 days are up, you have to withdraw, and you have 30 days to get your troops out. So you kind of have 90 days of operation going on. Now, this can be extended if Congress allows it. So Congress can keep extending this approval. But, I mean, the weirder thing today is, so this was made right after the Vietnam War. In today's warfare, 60 days is enough time for the United States to topple a country. Iraq was defeated basically in a month. It took a month of the Air Force and the Humvees and all those things basically rolling across the desert to defeat the government of Iraq. But once you've defeated a country or destabilized a country or attacked a compound or a leadership of a nation, is it over? No. A lot of times it takes like rebuilding the country or helping the people set up a new country because you don't want a power vacuum, which is kind of what happened in Iraq. You had a power vacuum where Saddam Hussein had kind of harshly controlled the people, and then it was gone. And that left kind of openings in Western Iraq for a group called ISIS to gain some ground and to gain some sovereignty in that region where they were keeping out the Iraqi government in some ways and taking advantage of the supplies left behind by the U.S. government as far as like tanks and stuff like that. So even in today, 50 years later after this War Powers Act was passed, warfare has kind of changed. And warfare continues to change and be more complex than we are necessarily prepared for, where the president has this ability and there's not a lot of restrictions. Just think of drone warfare, the idea that the president can strike any place on the planet with a drone without any congressional approval. And there can be immense casualties. Barack Obama basically started this unrestricted drone warfare that has had a lot of civilian casualties. Children, older people not involved with terrorism have been casualties to this drone warfare that began roughly 10 years ago. So the situations become really, really complex, and further complex when Congress basically says things like the president can wage war against terrorism, which is basically the law that was passed in the early 2000s. And you'll read about that a little bit in a different reading about congressional abdication. Essentially, Congress is giving up some warfare powers to the president. Terrorism is a pretty broad term. There are domestic terrorists. Does that mean the president can wage war on domestic terrorism in the United States? Can the president wage war on any terrorism? There's a lot of different things going on across the planet. There's terrorist groups in Russia that are attacking the Russian government. Could the United States attack Russia under these pretenses? I don't know. I mean, that becomes a legal conundrum where the president has a lot of military strength here, a lot of power when you can control the troops. And hey, we're going to talk about foreign policy a little bit more later in this class. Probably have a brief overview in one of the upcoming units. But know that we have a lot of military operations. Just on the top right, you can see all the military operations we've had over the last, I believe, 60 years. So plenty of military operations. This is not counting all the different bases we have too. Our military is everywhere. And I will stop it right there for you.